Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be going through the glossary that's on the inside of your pattern. Some patterns have glossaries, some don't. This pattern is Butterick pattern 5789 and it has 7 stitches in its glossary. I'm going to be adding one more stitch in this video. When I first started sewing with patterns, I didn't know what these words meant, so I wanted to make a video to maybe help you if you're struggling with the stitches that are on the inside of the glossary. I really do hope this video will help. So let's get started. Okay everybody, so let's get started with the first stitch. We're going to start with the double stitch, and your glossary says the double stitch is the stitch seam along the seam line. That is what I'm doing right now. I'm stitching on a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I have my right sides facing on the inside. This white that you see is the outside of my fabric because you always stitch with your right sides together. And you also always back stitch at the beginning and end of your seam. So back to the glossary, it says to stitch seam along seam allowance, which is what that is right there. And then you stitch again 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance using a straight stitch or zigzag stitch, trim close to second stitching or overlock seam. So right now I am starting the second stitch 1/4 of an inch away inside the seam allowance. You don't want to be outside. Make sure that you're inside the seam allowance. And right now I am changing the setting on my machine from a straight stitch to a zigzag stitch because, like the glossary just said, you can also use a zigzag stitch. So I want to just show you what that will look like. Or you can do what I do. I always just use my serger to finish off my edges. And that is the straight stitch to straight stitch. That's the zigzag. And that is the serger, the black one. If you don't have a serger, you can always use picking shears. I grabbed those up from Walmart and they work just fine. This stitch right here is the ease stitch. The glossary says an ease stitch is to stitch along the seam line using long machine stitches. Long machine stitch is better known as a basting stitch. It is the longest stitch that your machine can do. Mine goes up to 5, some goes up to 4. I've heard some go up to 6, so just check to make sure what stitch your machine goes up to, and that is your basting stitch. You can use basting stitches when you just need to hold pieces together. You can also use them when you just want to sew something and then try it on, make sure it fits before you put your regular machine stitch in, because basting stitches are easier to just pull out. And so with the ease stitch, you would just pull it and then ease it in. I see ease stitching when I'm doing sleeve caps, when I need to put sleeves into garments. Sometimes you would need to put an ease stitch on the seam line so that you can ease the sleeve cap in a little bit better. The next stitch that we will be doing is the gather stitch. What your glossary does not say is that the ease stitch and the gather stitch is the same thing, except the gather stitch, you need 2 rows of the basting stitches 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance. And so I just did the first one on the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'm doing the second row of basting stitches 1/4 of an inch in the seam allowance. And with basting stitches, you do not need to back stitch because you're going to keep your thread long at the end. That way you can pull it so that you can gather it. Same thing with the ease stitch. Keep your thread long. That way you can pull it and you can gather it. And when I say pull it, you only need to pull the front thread. You don't need to pull both of them or the back one. The front one will gather it if you pull it. Pull it gently. You don't need to, pull it too hard. You don't want it to pop. So just take your time and gather your fabric. This is what, if you've seen the really nice, pretty gathered skirts that the women are wearing, this is what they're doing when they make them. They're just using 2 rows of gather stitches and they're gathering the fabric up. And we're going to move right on to the understitch. I see understitching when I am doing garments that have facings. I usually do skirts, some blouses they have facing as well. You would need to press your seam allowance toward the facing, not toward the skirt or shirt, whatever you're making. You press your seam allowance toward the facing. Then you would turn it over and you would stitch right on that seam right there. which would be on the facing, not on your skirt or blouse. You would be sewing right on the edge of your facing, making sure that you're also sewing the seam allowance down on it. And I'm going to show you what I mean right now. The glossary defines the understitch as, it tells you to open out the facing or underside of garment, stitch to seam allowance close to seam. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm stitching the seam allowance close to the seam. Or I'm stitching the facing to the seam allowance close to the seam. There we go. And once you're done, it will look like this. What you do now is you would want to fold it down and give it a really good press. Here's an example right here of a skirt that I made. That is the facing, that is the skirt. And so I'm going to open it up, and then you will be able to see where I pressed the seam allowance toward the facing. Press that up toward the facing, not toward the skirt. And then you would stitch the seam allowance to the facing right on that edge. And then you give it a good press. And now you have a really nice, clean edge to your skirt. There's no waistband on that skirt. It's just a nice clean finish with the facing turned on the inside. This stitch here is the top stitch. The top stitch, the glossary says, on the outside, stitch 1/4 of an inch from edge, seam, or previous stitching using presser foot as guide, or stitch where indicated in instructions. So I just stitch 1/4 of an inch away from my edge, and that is a top stitch. This is an example of where you would see top stitching at. This is one of my boys' collars. You can also see them on cuffs of shirts. That's a top stitch, and that's an edge stitch. And right here, I'm finishing up the edge stitch. That one is not in the glossary. This is the extra stitch that I wanted to do. And you're literally just sewing right on the edge. With these stitches, you really want to take your time because they will show. So you want them to be straight and as neat as possible. And the first stitch is the top one, top stitch, and the second one is the edge stitch. Last stitch that we're going to be doing is the narrow hem. And if you don't trust eyeballing it, just grab your seam gauge or your measuring tape and just find your seam. And just find your hem allowance. And then once you have it, you go ahead and give it a good press and press it down. Okay, and so with the narrow hem, you want to take your raw edges and you want to fold those to that crease that you made when you press down your hem. And then you want to fold that down and give that a press. That creates your narrow hem. The glossary says a narrow hem, you turn in hem and press, ease in fullness if necessary, open out hem, then turn in again so the raw edge is a long crease, press, and turn in a long crease and stitch. And that's exactly what I just showed you. And so now I'm stitching right on the edge of the opening. I'm not stitching on the edge of the hem. I'm stitching on the opening of the seam. Right there, you want to make sure that you back stitch at the end. Clip off your threads, and that's your narrow hem.
Thanks for watching the video. I hope that it helped. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.